Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to celebrate our Hettleman Prize winners for this year. Now, this event is the official kickoff to University Research Week, and that's a pan-campus celebration of Carolina's research excellence. In addition to the Hettleman Awards, we have a full week of events that are planned for the campus community. And the links to all the live events are listed on our website, researchweek.unc.edu. For example, on Wednesday at 11 a.m., there will be a panel discussion on the documentary Human Nature, which is focusing on gene editing along ethical boundaries. Then on the same day, Wednesday at 5:30 p.m., we have a panel discussion on COVID-19 research by UNC investigators. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. Kizzy Corbett. This is special to us because Kizzy graduated from Carolina in 2014 with her PhD in micro and immunology. She currently is a viral immunologist at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, and she is the scientific lead for the coronavirus team to accelerate the development of a vaccine. So there are many, many more events that are occurring throughout the week. So again, please visit our website, researchweek.unc.edu, for a daily listing. Now for today, the Hettleman Prize was established in 1986, and it was generously endowed by the Phillip and Ruth Hettleman Foundation. The Hettleman Prize is the most prestigious award offered by UNC Chapel Hill for research, scholarship, or artistic achievement by younger faculty. Those eligible for the award are second-term assistant professors and any associate professor who will not have been in rank longer than 3 years at the time. Phillip Hettleman was a New York investment banker and member of UNC's class of 1921. He attended UNC on a scholarship, and he never forgot that that scholarship allowed him to go to college. And as a result, he really wanted to give back to UNC. So Phillip married Ruth McGregor Ray, who graduated from Columbia University. And today we are honoring their memories by honoring our early career faculty. The Hettleman lectures are short 10 to 15 minute TEDx-like talks from each of the 4 winners. The presentations are usually followed by a reception where everyone could meet and talk with the scholars, but unfortunately not this year. And I do hope we will be able to continue this tradition next year with our winners of this year combined with our winners of next year. So this year's Hettleman scholars are Mohit Bansal, and he is the John R. and Louise S. Parker Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science. And then Andrea Bowman, who's an Associate Professor in the Department of Music. Angela Smith, Associate Professor in the Department of Urology. And William Sturkey, Assistant Professor in the Department of History. The talks will be given in alphabetical order, and given that we have a large virtual audience, the talks will not be followed by questions. However, each speaker said that they would be pleased to engage with anyone that would like to follow up with them in the coming weeks. All right, so we'll start with Mohit Bansal. Mohit has been recognized by a staggering number of highly competitive industry, government, and faculty awards. He is an expert in natural language processing and machine learning. Mohit's focus has been on the development of human-like dialogue using artificial intelligent agents that possess generalizable, common sense, knowledge, and semantic skills. His ultimate goal is to develop agents that are engaging, personality-based, and perform actions that are grounded in the user's surrounding environment. Mohit received his doctorate in computer science from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's of technology from the Indian Institute of Technology. So Mohit, I will turn it over to you, and welcome. You're on.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Bridget, and thanks everyone for attending. Really excited to be a part of this year's cohort. And like Terry said, also part of next year for meeting the future winners and participating and doing more Q&A with all of you. So Bridget, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can, Mohit. We can see the window over on the right, the export. There we go.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so since the talks are short, 12 minutes, what I'm planning to do is give a brief overview of what our lab does at UNC. And then, like Terry said, I would be extremely happy to, actually that's the point of this talk, at least for me, is to look for future collaborations and get application and domain experts to help us further. So one of the main goals in my lab is to build conversational assistants or personal assistants, as they're called, or robotic agents that are knowledge rich in terms of common sense and other world knowledge, and are also multimodal in the sense that they can not just be looking at language and text, but also using vision, images, videos, all the way to action, being able to take actions in the environment around them. So this is an example of like what all are the requirements that we would like to have in such assistants. As you can see, I've put some images of common such conversational assistants or dialogue models that you use at home these days, or the canonical green little robot that would be the future optimal version of such devices. So these are some of the bullets or the bubbles that we would want these models to have as skills. So one would be common sense and external knowledge, as I mentioned. The other is we want them to be able to be personalized and have individualistic responses based on the type of user they are talking to, also be able to simplify things, have customized responses. Then there should be sort of a feedback loop where they can take user satisfaction into account and also handle robustness against adversaries and against errors, either intended or unintended. They should have more convincing and trustworthy portfolios, including things such as politeness, rudeness, human personality aspects, and paralinguistic axes. And at the end, the last bubble says that they should also be able to, like I said, be able to ground in the surroundings around them and be able to look at things beyond text. And for example, databases, videos, and so on, and eventually also be able to take actions for instructions given to them. So I'll give a brief overview of some of the example projects that we have in these different axes. The first one is how do we build language generation models that can have semantic skills or controlled knowledge. So if you look at the two examples on these on the screen, these are simplified examples for two tasks. The left side is video captioning, where given a short video clip from YouTube or any random video source, can we be able to generate the textual or verbal or language-based output of the description of these videos. And the right side is the task called automatic document summarization. Again, it's simplified and a short version of it. But given a very long document of thousands of words, can we generate automatically a short 100-word or 50-word summary of these documents? So the idea of one particular theme of our continuous series of papers in our lab has been how do we make these models not hallucinate? So by hallucination, I mean some of the red things that I've highlighted on the slide, where these state-of-the-art machine learning, deep learning models are able to produce some of the content of the input in the output summaries or the captions, but they are still either mentioning some unrelated information or contradicting information in the input. So this would be known as hallucination in this scenario. And there's been a series of work from our group and other groups on how to be able to use multitask and reinforcement learning style models to be able to control this phenomenon so that they can avoid hallucinating. Another example on this screen is showing a long document, input document at the top. Again, this is not the full document, but part of it. And the ground truth summary, if you can see the mouse pointer, is the one that's written by a human. And this is one of the appropriate ground truth summaries for this document. Whereas some of the state-of-the-art deep learning neural network-based models, even though they can do a pretty good job at summarizing this article automatically, they have these red issues, which are again hallucinations, where they will start talking about people like John Hartson and additional assistant Alan Muir, even though the input document at hand does not mention these people at all. And this is because from their training signals and the data that they're using, these phenomena might have occurred so many times that they start hallucinating this information for any document that does not even mention these people. So our model at the bottom is one example where it's able to reduce such hallucinations. And one way, I cannot get into very detailed model level discussions, but these are things we can have offline chats about. But the idea would be that this is an example of a multitask learning model, where if the original task is this diagonal of a video generating its caption, these are known as RNN LSTM models, which are basically recurrent neural networks, where the information from the current hidden state is a nonlinear combination of all the previous hidden states, and they're a nonlinear projection of the previous hidden states. So the idea would be that if you're trying to convert the video to its caption in the diagonal arrow here, then the encoder, which is encoding the information of the frames of the video, will also be forced to generate the future part of the video. This would enhance the encoder to be able to acquire some knowledge about missing actions, incomplete frames, and so on. And the right side language decoder has its own auxiliary task, which is called entailment generation, which means that given a longer premise sentence, can the model automatically generate a shorter hypothesis that's a logically entailed subset of the information in the input. So these are examples of how you could combine different tasks in the same joint model such that the main primary task of video captioning gets benefits from the training signals of the related task. Another example of error that we could collaborate on and discuss about is dialogue generation. So basically, you would look at this top side of the figure here, and if you're talking to one of these assistants at home and you mention this sentence, I think I'm having a heart attack, ideally, hopefully you would want the agent to start describing at least the definition of what the symptoms might be for heart attack, whereas something even small and surprising changes, like making a small perturbation in my utterance and saying, I'm afraid I'm having a heart attack, many of these systems will basically go to the bottom right, where they will not understand things and say, my apologies, I don't understand what you mean. So then ideally we would want this diagonal arrow to retrain the model in a way that it can go back to the original response. So this is a problem in which basically what we showed is that you can have these very small changes to the input, like randomly swapping a couple of words or doing stop word dropout, like dropping a sort of less important word from the conversation. And the model should not change its response, but it does. Or the opposite, where you add important small changes like negations or antonyms and the response should change, but it does not. So it's overstable. So we worked a lot on how to make these models robust against such user errors or adversarial attacks. The second part of the talk is more on how to make language models and conversational assistants more grounded visually in the surrounding world. The idea here is that you would want them ideally to be able to see daily activities around it, given obviously privacy access, and assuming that you want it to be seeing some certain things that you're wanting to have a conversation about. But the idea is then it should be able to condition on that information visually, as opposed to just the verbal information that you're giving it. So one canonical example from 6 years ago would be visual question answering, where the community created a data set on images and questions about these images. And the machine learning or natural language processing model should be able to automatically extract the answers for these questions. So one big use case of this is obviously image search, right? You can basically make a search engine such that you can ask questions about images on the web. But also there are many more useful cases, for example, for visual disability, where folks, this is a real data set of version of VQA, where folks with visual disability take certain photos from their phone and can ask the phone about questions about this image and then get answers back. So we worked on models that can get state-of-the-art results on such data sets and applications. And we've also extended these data sets to better modalities such as videos, because the world around us is not a static image, it's dynamic spatiotemporal localization. So what we've done is we've created one of the largest research data sets that can take videos based on daily activities, for example, from substitute and surrogate sources like TV shows, including crime, medical, and other genres. And we want to have systems that can take such questions that are compositional. What is someone holding when someone is talking to someone else about a certain object? So this way, the model has to both first figure out when is the part of the video happening where someone is holding the sword, and then also go back and look at the bounding box that this person is holding a computer. We've also done the retrieval version of this, where given thousands of videos, can you ask a natural language query, and your model should be able to figure out which video this event happened in and what is the timestamp, the exact timestamp and clip where this event happened. And I'll mention the social implications of this in a bit. But these are some extensions of this where question answering models should not be able to just take images or text, but many a times, for example, on Wikipedia pages itself, you would want the model to be able to merge information from images, text, as well as tables, because different types of questions will need different information, and many of them will also need you to merge the information. Lastly, we go beyond images and videos all the way to action, where we want to be able to have remote assistants as well as assistants in old age homes and other scenarios where we could be talking to them and they could be doing physical actions for us. For this, there's a lot of NLP problems that we are looking at. For example, ambiguity in language, where if we give it incomplete instructions such as pour me some water, the model should be able to understand, given its environment and all the objects in front of it, from where does the water get poured and to where does it get poured. So the source and the destination, using inference with common sense. So this is a project with our robotics collaborators where we basically start all the way from speech recognition to connect 3D sensors all the way to motion planning, where the incomplete instruction, you do predicate argument parsing on it, you realize what are the missing frames, the roles in the frames, then you fulfill them based on objects in the environment, and use a common sense reasoning module to understand that pouring water from a bottle to a cup is much more plausible than pouring it into a plate. There's some videos in the links that I'll share later, and you can also look at a demo version of it. And so there's other examples of this where you can also have navigational robots that can take instructions in language, turn right, go up the steps, walk to the right behind the 2 desks, and then stop when you reach the long wooden table. And we have models on this that can take such instructions and pursue these actions to reach the final destination, even specifically in unseen rooms where they need to generalize to views and viewpoints that they've never seen before. So this is an example of generalization where you can create new rooms and generate data for that, and then retrain the model to be able to generalize better to such rooms. So in interest of time, I'll skip this, the details of the model, but hopefully we can chat about this offline. So as I was mentioning, the social impact and applications of these examples that I gave are enormous. We have some ongoing collaborations with folks, both at UNC and other universities on these. So one would be if you have systems that can do sentence or document simplification and summarization, this allows you to give faster, easier information dissemination to people who either have language impairments or also folks from non-technical backgrounds. Then you also have conversational assistants that can be emotion-based, which leads to more convincing, trustworthy, and caring assistants, specifically for scenarios like old age home assistants, intelligent tutoring for children in education classrooms. And then you also have video-based versions of these intelligent tutoring systems that can look at visual information around them. Finally, the robotic navigational instruction agents can allow you to do things such as safely sitting remotely in your office while the robotic agent can pursue actions such as rescuing in buildings on fire. So the last couple of slides I'll mention as collaboration opportunities would be that we have a lot of effort also on the topic of fake news detection and fact verification, where given, so for example, all of Wikipedia and a single claim, how can we build models that can verify whether this claim is verifiable or refutable? And what is the evidence behind this verification or refuting? We've also worked on using NLP to understand sexual harassment personal stories and automatically be able to classify them semi-automatically so as to partially fill victim reports for police verifications. And we have done things like using NLP for interpreting linguistic characteristics of Alzheimer's dementia, where we have shown that in addition to speech, there are also certain grammatical patterns that NLP models could help automatically figure out, and also interpret why does it think that this particular grammatical pattern is more common in AD patients as opposed to otherwise. And the last example in my talk is a recent project that we did with Ben Frey, who's a faculty member in the American Studies department at UNC, where we wanted to revitalize the dying language of Cherokee. And for this, we have created one of the largest first parallel data in Cherokee and English, and also developed 20 automated machine translation models, such that this will encourage both our machine learning community as well as the Cherokee community to be able to convert a lot of new information in both directions. So we have English to Cherokee and Cherokee to English models. So thanks to my students who do all the great work, and our collaborators. And like I said, thank you, and let's collaborate. And here's my information on the last slide. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mohit. Very interesting and very informative. Our next speaker is Andrea Bowman, and Andrea's scholarship resides in what I would say is a still relatively young academic field of sound studies. She's recognized for her keen ability to weave diverse approaches and points of focus, ranging from on-the-street experience to cultural capital and art music. Andrea received her doctorate from Harvard University in historical musicology. Additionally, she holds a master's in advanced musical studies from the University of London and a bachelor's in music with concentrations in music history and violin performance from Stanford University. Andrea?
Thanks so much, everyone. I pre-recorded a video that I'm going to play for you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to speak to you today. I'm going to play back a pre-recorded video in hopes that it'll help you hear the sound a little bit better. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase, the sound of protest? Emotionally energized individuals speaking out in full voice to make demands? A crowd united in performance, overcoming difference to take up space, in the process giving creative expression to shared values and hopes? Or perhaps a symbolic song or track that captures the spirit of a movement, the voice of the many, speaking truth to power.
Musimy głośno powiedzieć 1, 3, 1, 2, policja krew na rękach ma 1, 3, 1, 2, policja krew na rękach ma 1, 3, 1, 2, policja krew na rękach ma 1, 3, 1, 2, policja krew na rękach ma.
Pod pomikiem zapraszamy, my będziemy o 14:30.
In my research on the relationship between sound and social movements, loud moments in which sonic expression seemingly distills the politics of a movement into a bite-sized package sizzle with political power, emotional meaning, and symbolic inspiration. Participants and allies alike remember raucous protest chants, are riled up by angry political songs, and cherish inspirational protest anthems, like you just heard. Journalists pepper descriptions of the scene with attention to the elevated emotions they experienced when they hear music. In the 21st century, videos of such coherent, transformative moments go viral. That's to say that if my opening questions conjured up an extraordinary role for sound and music on the stage of protest for you, you share a sonic image of protest with many, including my interlocutors, organizers, musicians, and citizens who worked and continue to work toward political change in Poland. Sound is integral to Western ideals of dissent's public performance. And it's not just that loud sounds and singing stick out in our stories and memories, residue of heightened emotional states, awareness, and attentional audition, though that is true. Each of the examples I have shared reflects the close association that exists between voice and political agency in the West. Having a voice and speaking out are preconditions to being heard. On the streets, when people occupy, demonstrate, march, and blockade, sound and music choreograph protest as a rupture of the everyday. Sound and music shape protest as something different from the normal, comfortable, or usual. Protest time is time disrupted, time suspended. From the perspective of my intellectual homes, music and sound studies, this is hardly surprising. Noisiness unsettles in ways that inspire and even repel, even frighten. Put differently, sound and music arrange bodies, those of performers and listeners, in real time. For example, a felt sense of regular pulse beats organizes spoken utterances into collective chant. Its loudness relative to the environment orients our ears tuning in. A familiar melody, like that of the Polish song sung to celebrate birthdays I played back earlier, makes choral unison possible. Sonic experiences such as these make us aware that time does not always pass in the same way. In other words, sound and music interact with, shape, our experiences of protest time. The other sounds of protest I share with you today nudge me to hear protest not only as it disrupts and calls upon us to act with or against. Sound emphasizes protest's duration and endurance, as well as its multitudinous complexity. For the sake of time, my meditation begins on the celebrated invisible stages of demonstration. I take a page from my research methods as I play back sound carefully selected for you. I invite you to learn from your listening experience. The captions suggest how I hear and interpret the ideas captured in the sound recordings I study. After all, sound recordings mediate our sense of time too. They enable us to reproduce sound, but also manipulate it, edit, splice, distort, and amplify it. We'll sound out protest from the occupational strikes that disrupted the Gdańsk shipyards over August 1980 through the decade that followed. There's a tremendous audio archive of this time, as journalists flocked to scenes of political activity to witness and document. Organizers used these tape recordings as a means to spread word about what had happened, what issues spurred debate and disagreement. Music flowed on these cassette tapes, too. Some from the scene of protest, some dubbed onto tape to make listening experiences more varied.
W tej mównicy bardzo często. Ten tekst wczoraj, który słyszałam w wykonaniu tego, ten pan na poczekaniu skomponował melodię, tak coś jak balladę. Sam tekst zaczyna się wspaniale, bo są proste słowa. Nie mam teraz czasu dla ciebie, nie widziała cię długo matka. Jeszcze trochę poczekaj. O tych ludziach, którzy poczuli, że są wreszcie...
Nie mam teraz czasu dla ciebie. Nie widziała cię długo matka. Jeszcze trochę poczekaj, dorośnij. Opowiemy ci o tych wypadkach, o tych dniach pełnych nadziei, pełnych rozmów i sporów gorących, o tych nocach kiepsko przespanych, w naszych sercach mocno bijących.
Nie mam teraz czasu dla ciebie, nie wiedziała cię długo matka.
Sound recording made and makes bodies vulnerable. Many nation states track protests by using sound recording's powerful potential as a surveillance technology. In communist Poland, the secret police tapped private conversations. Guards in detention centers tried to overhear organizers strategizing together while they awaited trial. Organizers manipulated sound to subvert these efforts. They slowed down tape recordings to make it harder to understand, to listen to voices.
Rzeszów, 2 luty 1982 roku, godzina 20. W ośrodku odosobnienia dla internowanych w Załężu. Godzina 21. Do tej pory była cisza. 230.
To conclude, I'd like to step back from this guided listening to the past to the unfolding of historical time that research on sound and protest makes possible. My examples today explore the work through music and sound beyond loud and celebrated moments. But sometimes the mundane power of sound is right on the surface of our protest experiences. In a recent composition titled The Reign of Applause, the New York-based sound artist Maria Chavez nods to such moments. Her remix of sounds excavated from this summer's Twitter feeds of protest focuses on the energy and consistency of participants clapping. The next time you encounter protest, take a cue from Chavez and take a cue from my interlocutors. Listen for something you don't at first notice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. That was really interesting. Our next speaker is Angela Smith. Angela is the Director of Urologic Oncology at the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center here on campus. And she is an associate professor and also vice chair for academic affairs in the urology department. Her research includes health services and biostatistics with interest in patient-centered outcomes, risk stratification, and quality of care for invasive bladder cancer. Angela also serves as the Assistant Secretary of the American Urological Association and is on their Quality Improvement and Patient Safety Committee. Angela received her medical degree and master's in clinical research from UNC Chapel Hill, and she also completed her residency here. Angela, take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you again for this tremendous honor and your generous introduction. Today, I'm pleased to share my research on engaging patients for better care. Before I begin, I'd just like to share a few disclosures, which include grant funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute and the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, as well as being on the study advisory board for several companies as they relate to patient engagement, which I'm going to discuss today. So what if I told you that I developed a new product for consumers, but I didn't bother to learn what consumers needed? I didn't involve them in tweaking the product as I brought it to market, and I didn't use any advertisements to market the product to consumers. You probably tell me that my product would fail because I left out a very important and probably obvious perspective in that process, the consumer. But yet, this is exactly what we've done for decades in clinical research. The researcher decides on what to study, they decide how to study it, how and if to market or disseminate the results, all without the patient's perspective in the process. And so it's really no wonder that over half of clinical trials fail, many due to the lack of patient recruitment, which results in a tremendous amount of wasted time, energy, and money. So in the next 10 minutes, I'd just like to convince you that patient engagement is not only important, but also critical for designing cost-effective and meaningful research, illustrating this through an example of how I've used engagement in my own research, and ending with what I see as the future of patient-centered research. But before I get into all of that, I wanted to define what I mean by patient engagement, which is essentially research being carried out with or by members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. So we're not talking about patients being enrolled in a clinical trial, but rather sitting at the table next to researchers, providing input on research design and interpretation of results. So the concept of patient engagement isn't entirely new. Sir Chalmers, who's a British Health Services researcher, he's one of the founders of the Cochrane collaboration, asked this question in the mid-90s. Would researchers be helped to do more relevant research if the public became more involved in planning and promoting research? And over the next several decades, some partnerships slowly emerged, taking off more rapidly in 2010, when PCORI, which is a funding agency devoted to the patient's voice, was formed. Meanwhile, as I contemplated the concept of patient engagement in my own research, I began asking myself how I could potentially develop this in my area of expertise, which is bladder cancer. I'd always been interested in bladder cancer research for many reasons, but one of which was there had been very little research progress I noticed in the past several decades. In fact, it was striking to me that my own grandfather, who died of bladder cancer before I was able to meet him, he received largely the same treatment I was providing my own patients over 30 years later. So I attended the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network think tank, which is what I think is a unique conference in that it brings together not only researchers, but also patient advocates. And it was fortuitous that in that same year, PCORI had released a funding opportunity for researchers who wished to create infrastructure to design patient engagement programs. So I knew I had the necessary ingredients. So we had patient advocates and a potential funding source to create this engagement infrastructure from the ground up. And so in speaking with my patients, I didn't want to simply start with the research question, but I wanted to take a step back and understand my patients' priorities. So I could create a systematic process by which we generate the new research questions that patients feel are important to their care. We critically evaluate the literature for gaps. We identify which treatments are best for specific patients, and then ultimately provide patients with the tools they need to make better decisions for themselves. And so from here, with successful funding for a 2-year PCORI Engagement Award, we developed a network of patients and caregivers to identify and prioritize unanswered questions important to patients with bladder cancer. And we accomplished this through a number of steps, the first involving recruitment using a variety of methods. We used an existing online forum, webinars, we sent out mailers to urban and rural practices who treat bladder cancer, as well as using social media and blogs. And from there, we generated research questions by asking patients and researchers at the think tank to list the most salient research questions facing patients with bladder cancer. We then compiled all of those into a second survey, asking those same individuals to rank order them. And then we convened in a meeting to identify the top 3 to 4 questions for each disease stage, non-invasive, invasive, and metastatic. And this is actually a picture of that first meeting. And then we sent a survey to the newly formed survey network asking them to rank the questions. And importantly, we allowed free text research questions so we could identify additional questions that we as researchers may not have considered. And so while the first year had only 350 respondents, by the second year, we'd grown to over 1,000. And at this point, we're almost at 2,000 patients around the US and Canada and actually across the world. But we couldn't stop there because we needed to ensure that the research community was aware of these priorities. And so we fed back the information to the Patient Survey Network, to Beacon, as well as funding agencies. I picked up the phone and called program officers at the National Cancer Institute, PCORI, ARC. I also published a paper in Cancer to disseminate the priorities to researchers like myself. And lo and behold, for the first time ever, PCORI had listed bladder cancer as one of its 18 key priority areas for the year, listing the #1 ranked question from our prioritization exercise, which focused on high-risk non-invasive bladder cancer, comparing cystectomy or bladder removal to medical therapy or bladder preservation treatment. And so we knew we had to get to work quickly because 1, we had to put together a proposal to answer that question for our patients, but 2, we wanted to continue our process for patient engagement, moving beyond research prioritization, which we had accomplished at this point, to now empowering patients to be part of the research team around the country. And we knew we would need to focus on training to make that happen. Because in speaking with many of my colleagues, they were at a loss as to how to partner with patients, as was I, to be honest. And patients likewise were uncomfortable joining research teams. So there was a very clear gap in creating this patient researcher partnership. And so we went back to the drawing board to ask for funding to create an expanding cohort of patient experts, patients with bladder cancer, with research training and expertise and engagement. And so with this funding, we were able to create a sustainable learning platform with a patient mentorship model such that patient experts would continually extend the community of engaged bladder cancer stakeholders for future design and execution of bladder cancer specific clinical research for any researcher across the country. So once this was in place, we turned our attention to answering the prioritized research question listed in PCORI's priority list. And we knew we needed to have a patient-informed research question, we needed study outcomes, and a research design. And so hearkening back to that very first slide of my talk with the consumer, we essentially needed to understand what our patients wanted to know and how we were going to study it. And so if we focus directly on what the researchers told us, and this is literally a snapshot of PCORI's funding announcement, our what would have included mortality and progression, side effects and quality of life, and our how would have been a randomized control trial. But rather than taking that at face value, we took a step back and we incorporated our patient advisory team and engagement work. So regarding the what, our published article showed that nearly 2/3 of patients in the survey network were interested in comparing bladder removal with medical treatment for high-risk non-invasive bladder cancer. So we knew we had a highly relevant question. However, we also asked patients to identify the outcomes that they felt were most important. And while some of them, such as quality of life and survival, did mirror PCORI's suggestion, others didn't, including caregiver burden, financial impact, and the ability to retain one's bladder. So we knew we needed to include these additional outcomes in our design. And finally, regarding the how, we asked patients whether they would be willing to enroll in a study in which they would be randomized to one of 2 treatments. And interestingly, over 90% said no, which solidified the need to pivot to a prospective cohort design rather than a randomized control trial. And so had we lacked this perspective, our trial would have been doomed to fail. And so from here, our study SISTO was born, evaluating the outcomes most important to a patient facing this decisional dilemma in a way that patients would be willing to enroll, all overlaid with a patient-centered leadership structure, which would include a data coordinating center for analysis, a clinical coordinating center with practice sites around the country, but uniquely also a stakeholder coordinating center, which would include a patient advisory board along with clinician and national advisory boards to ensure its relevance to patients. And through these efforts, we were successfully funded for an $8.5 million project to enroll 900 patients across 28 sites in the country to answer one of the most critical questions facing patients with non-invasive bladder cancer. It's a question that probably every single clinic I'm faced with my patients that I don't yet have an answer to. So in terms of my future vision for patient engagement in clinical research, in the area of bladder cancer, we're working down the list of prioritized questions, looking at anything from the impact of treatment on caregivers to the best options to reduce discomfort during bladder procedures, all of which came directly from patients who spoke about their experience and unanswered questions. Additionally, our team of patient experts with bladder cancer is now working with researchers across the country on a variety of projects, so disseminating our engagement work to other research groups in other institutions. And speaking even more broadly, we're now using the techniques we developed in patient engagement to apply these to other areas outside of bladder cancer, including most recently kidney and prostate cancer. And as I end this talk, I'll leave you with this quote, which I think sums up the importance of the patient's voice in clinical research. Healthcare is at the beginning of a dialogue with the world, and as healthcare providers, we have to ask ourselves this question: what stories are we not hearing? And for me, patient engagement allows us to not only hear patient stories, but to use research to change them for the better. Before I end, none of the work that I showed today would be possible without my team. And of course, any good team has coaches, teammates, and cheerleaders. So first, I'd like to thank my coaches. They're my mentors who've guided me along the way. These include Matt Nielsen from urology, Hy Muss from geriatric oncology, Morris Weinberger from the Gilling School of Public Health, and Ethan Bash from the Cancer Outcomes Research Program, along with all the wonderful resources from the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center, the University Cancer Research Fund, and the School of Medicine. I'd also like to thank my research team, of whom there are many, but in particular, I want to say thank you to my research partner, John Gore from University of Washington, Dana Mueller, my wonderful research assistant, Stephanie and Morgan from Beacon, countless patients that I've worked with for the survey network, as well as my very supportive Department of Urology. And of course, last but not least, my cheerleaders, my cheer team. They say it takes a village, and I definitely have one. Special thanks to my parents and my family for their support, my in-laws, my friends, and of course, my husband, Patrick, and my girls, Charlie and Mira, who I know are watching right now and bring me great joy in everything I do. Hi, girls. So again, thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you for this tremendous honor.
Okay, thank you, Angela. And we will move to our fourth speaker, and that's William Sturkey. William specializes in the history of race in the American South, and he has an interest in the histories of working class racial minorities. He teaches courses on modern American history, Southern history, the Civil Rights Movement, and the history of America in the 1960s. During the 2017-18 academic year, he was named one of 2 faculty recipients of the UNC Diversity and Inclusion Award. William earned a doctorate in history from the Ohio State University. Additionally, he holds a master's in African American Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's in history and African American Studies from the Ohio State University. And I also want to note that on Thursday at 4 p.m., as part of University Research Week, William will be a panelist on the American Academy of Arts and Sciences sponsored panel entitled Telling the Regional Story, the Narratives that Unite and Divide in North Carolina. William, it's all yours.
Great, thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here. And I actually don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to speak into the screen. So I'm a historian of the disappeared. I see the people who have been discarded in our collective memory, and I study the lives of people who many other historians didn't think were that important. I study people who look like me, and I have this radical idea that the historical experiences of Black and Brown people are just as important as those of white people. For a variety of reasons, as a young man, I was drawn to the study of race. My own racial background is deeply complex. Got Civil War veterans on both sides of the war, enslaved people, slave owners, Native Americans. But the driving force of my own identity has always been that I was not white, mostly that I was Black. And that's how race in America generally operates, right? Historically, you're either white or you're not. And so that's how I experienced race in my youth, oftentimes in a negative way that led me to searching for answers. And I turned to history to pursue those answers. When I was in graduate school, training to become a historian, I wanted to study marginalized voices, people who have been written out of our national narratives because of sheer racism, or because their stories make our national narratives more tricky. Ask George Washington where he got his teeth, for example. But fast forward a few years, I wrote a book about a community in the South, a place called Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I wrote about the history of Jim Crow in that city. And I wrote about it from both white and Black perspectives. The chapters of the book go back and forth, alternating between the white and the Black communities as they move through this journey of life in the modern American South. And I was interested in telling the story about Black Southerners beyond the victimization narratives that dominate so much of our histories. I wanted to write about what Black people actually did, as opposed to just what was done to them. But then I also wanted to learn about how white people experienced this era and how their own challenges affected race in a place across time. And studying and writing these chapters was a remarkable experience. One of the things that became very clear to me right away was that I was actually writing in two different genres. The Black and the white communities existed at the exact same time in the same setting, just across the railroad tracks, but writing their histories are completely different tasks, both in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and all across America. The sources are different. For the white community, you can go into the archives, you can look at the local newspapers, you can go to the Historical Society, and so on and so forth. But none of that exists for the Black community. In previous decades, it never occurred to a lot of white people that Black people mattered and that one day somebody might want to talk about our histories. It never occurred to them that historians like me might come along and want to reconstruct the lives of their Black neighbors. And so the archivists and librarians in previous decades didn't go to Black communities to ask for their diaries and their letters and their pictures and their scrapbooks. The archive itself was and is literally segregated. And Black people in their communities were not mentioned in the local newspaper, which itself was also segregated. These people have been disappeared by our society, by processes during their own lives, and by generations of historians who never bothered to care. So to tell those stories, I had to go a different route. I used oral histories, census records, property records, whatever I could find. But I also hit upon a treasure trove that is only available through modern technology. You see, the Black people of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, of course, knew that they were segregated and excluded from local public life. And so they worked to create a parallel version of society. And part of creating that parallel version of society was celebrating their lives. And to do that, they would send updates from their community to Northern Black newspapers. They knew that their birthday parties, their meetings, their graduations would not be included in the local press. So they wrote their own stories and they sent them to Black newspapers such as the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. So as it turns out, to research Black people in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, you need to go read the Chicago Defender. And modern technology has allowed for me and other researchers to now search for people in databases, whereas before it'd be like finding a needle in the haystack, thumbing through 60 pages of the Chicago Defender for every day. And so through these processes, I think we can tell non-white stories in really profound ways in this country, in ways that we never have before. And so through these processes, I wanted to create a rich, vibrant community of people who were so much more than merely victims of Jim Crow. They were fun-loving, ambitious, religious, and deeply intelligent people who built a community of their own despite the challenges they faced. Unlike some books that only talk about the things that happened to Black people, again, my book talks about the things that Black people did. I walk you through their neighborhoods and their schools, using the saga of one particular family to rescue those marginalized voices from the past and fold them into our historical understanding of life in the American South. In other words, I see and show you the people who were meant to be disappeared. And there was something I realized at the end of the process when the book came out and as it was being received. It was, of course, during this national and regional reckoning over the history of race. And one of my uncles said to me, he said, William, I see what you've done here. This is our monument. This is a monument to our people, to Black people. Some of the Black families I cover here have ancestors who have written to share their appreciation. And I thought a lot about that. In the South, every street, every statue, Every building is named after white people. You walk around and this is all yours. And not only that, some of the buildings and statues are put up to honor individual white people specifically because of what they did to Black people. So history is so many things. It's a story of who we are, a profound way to develop a sense of grounding, of morality, of heritage. It undergirds the sense of our identity. It is the story of us, of how we got here. When you prioritize white over Black history, when you celebrate some and disappear others, you are saying to the disappeared that you have no place here. This is not for you. I came to UNC because it was the best place in the country to study the history of race in America. And the thing I've learned the most, that's the thing that's been the most shocking over the last few years, is how many disappeared there are here. Did you know, for example, that the university was initially funded by acquiring property, including enslaved people, and selling them to pay for the initial endowment? Did you know that students here used to rent enslaved labor by the semester? Their bills included 3 categories: tuition, room and board, and servant hire. Did you know that there is a monument to the first generation of boards of trustees at Person Hall, and that those men owned roughly 2,000 people? Did you know that there are at least 70 Black bodies buried on campus in unmarked graves at the Rizzo Center? We celebrate our history at UNC all the time. It's written across our commemorative landscape, but the Black people who lived and worked here have been disappeared. I see the ghosts, they're all around us. In recent years, we've all heard the phrase, "you can't erase history," or "those who don't learn from our history are bound to repeat it." We often hear these in defense of keeping Confederate monuments or the names of white supremacists on our buildings, as if we might enslave 1/3 of the population and secede from the United States to invade Pennsylvania if we don't keep a Klansman's name on a building. The people who say these things have no idea how much history has actually already been erased. And then, of course, there are people griping about how history has become too political or too politically correct. That's one of the most ahistorical arguments you can make. History has always been political. It was political in the 1910s to put up a Confederate monument in the middle of campus. It was political in the 1920s to name buildings after former Klansmen and anti-Black political activists such as Josephus Daniels. It was political in the 1930s when UNC archivists actively sought documents that would, and I quote, "show up the master-slave relations prior to the Civil War in a new and more favorable light." It didn't just become political when people like me started writing history too. As the rest of our nation grapples with its racial history, I think our mission here should be really pretty simple. It should comprise of 3 things. 1, acknowledge the history of race in our communities, recognize the roles played by our institutions and its benefactors in those histories, and then provide moral and intellectual guidance for reckoning and ultimately reconciling with that history in a productive manner that helps to move us forward and sets us all free. One more thing. Not many people appreciate this, I think, but our university was founded for the democracy or for the republic. It was chartered in 1789, the same year our Constitution became the law of the land. When the United States was created, some of the leaders in North Carolina said, "Why have other republics in world history failed? What was the problem that they could not overcome that undermined their ability? As we embark on this great experiment of American democracy, what lessons can we learn?" And for many of them, they concluded that what happened was that other people had an undereducated population that was susceptible to liars and grifters, right? They weren't educated enough to participate actively as citizens in that republic, in that democracy. In stating the mission of the university, one of its founders talked about reasoning and useful knowledge in order to protect our democracy. Of course, in recent years, as many of you know, history has been in the news. People are turning to us all the time and asking, how can this be? Or where does this come from? Or how do you explain the state of things today? And we have a great many answers based on history. But one thing we don't say loudly enough is this: history and the liberal arts have been undergoing defunding for the past 40 years, including at this university. I read a story about the business school getting 2 gifts of $25 million. That's great. I'm thrilled for the business school. And our university has raised over $3 billion in recent years. That's wonderful. I give to the university. I give a lot to the university. I'm very glad that we've raised $3 billion in the last several years. But at the same time, in the history department, we are not going to have a graduate cohort this year because we can't afford it. You might assume that it's COVID, but the reality is that our instructional budget has been getting cut for years, even in a booming stock market with high enrollments and unprecedented interest in history. We pay our graduate students less than $16,000 a year, about half what they earn at some of our peers. It gives us a great deal of trouble attracting people to work here. And with this one-year moratorium, of course, we're going to have a shortage of teaching assistants, and I'm not sure what the future holds for us in liberal arts on this side of campus. We're certainly not alone in history. And I think it's fair to ask our administration, do you want to have graduate programs in liberal arts or not? And I'm not sure how many people value what we all do on this side of campus. We don't necessarily do 3D printing or COVID research, but we do teach evidence-based reasoning. We teach civics. We teach independent thinking. We teach people how to discern fact from fiction. We're not necessarily promoted like other departments and other schools. We don't have a lot of flashy new things. But when this university was created, the democracy itself was the flashy new thing. And that's why our institution was founded with liberal arts at its core. I think that's worth thinking about the next time you find yourself wondering, well, how in the world did we get here? Like many historians, I actually care a great deal more about the future than I do the past. And I look forward to the years to come working at this place, the University of the People. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, William. That was very passionate. And I do recommend people to read his book, which is on the website. So this concludes our celebration of the 2020 Hettleman Scholar Awardees. And I really want to thank and congratulate our 4 Hettleman Scholars and hope that we'll celebrate with them in person with the next year's awardees. These talks were recorded and you'll be able to see them on our website, researchweek.unc.edu. So thank you all for joining us for this very important event. And we look forward to having you attend the various scheduled activities during University Research Week over the next few days. So thank you and goodbye.